And now for the ever so colorful Charles Baudelaire. Two poems by him, two of his, probably his two most notorious ones. Now the man himself is quite infamous, but along with the legend there is some very real and very important literary and cultural influence. He is called both the first modern poet and the father of modern criticism, even though he's writing technically from the late Romantic period. To this day, he is the most widely read French poet around the world. And, quite ahead of his time, he was one of the first to experiment with prose poetry, or just regularly written words that are not put in the typical poetic stanzas, much like you're just simply writing a normal paragraph, but with the poetic touch of word choice and imagery and rhythm to the words. Prose poetry. He was one of the first. Now, Jean Duval, or his Black Venus. This was a Haitian Creole and the illegitimate daughter of a prostitute, and his most steady and stormy girlfriend, for a guy as, well, I mean, to be blunt, as for a man with as crazy a life as Baudelaire, this was the closest thing he had to a steady. His romantic, dark romantic muse with, again, his calling her his Black Venus. And she was just as wild and crazy as he was. She, like Baudelaire, died of syphilis. Crazy kids. Baudelaire was financially irresponsible, even causing his family to legally intervene. Gambling, you know. An alcoholic, an opium addict, and solicited many a prostitute, got a lot of STDs, and even dying from a syphilis-induced stroke at only 46 years old. So, certainly burning the candle at both ends, this man did. But his poetry, genius, perhaps in spite of the man, in spite of his weaknesses, in spite of his demons. Obviously, it demonstrates that he is haunted by a religiously framed vision of humanity as fallen and corrupt, himself, especially himself included. Kind of a very deep Catholic guilt, in spite of his always going back to his vices. In his poetry, perfection only exists at a distance, like some out-of-reach heaven. One is always thwarted. And obviously, very obviously, when you read just these two examples to the reader and a carcass, he intended to shock, to present the limitations of naive romanticism. Very into realism, before realism really set in as a literary period. Again, ahead of his time. And he was actually brought on trial for obscenity and blasphemy for The Flowers of Evil, which is the collection of poems from which these two poems come from, shortly after it was first published in 1857. And versus the nature-loving romantics, he was very much a city poet, a metropolitan poet. And a running theme throughout his poetry, and it is specifically mentioned in To the Reader, is ennui, a French word which signifies a deeply felt existential boredom. And for Baudelaire, this is just the root of all evil. Men are evil when they are experiencing ennui. Because, well, that's when you do stupid stuff. Okay. Good luck on the discussion questions.